I would like to welcome everybody to this semester's final Dinner at the Grounds at the Loyal Jones Appalachian Center. Just to remind everybody, your phones, keep them quiet and buzzing in your pocket. I just remembered to do mine. I was very proud of myself because in class the other day it went off and I was a little embarrassed. Our restrooms, should you need them, are down on the right if you are not used to it. Our talk will go on to about 12:50 today, but as always we know that there's a need for people often to go in and out, and so please don't feel constrained to sit in your seat if you need it. To introduce our speaker today, I'm going to introduce Kenny Madden, who is a sociologist, and also a peace and social justice studies minor, and who has been working here at the center for a couple of years, and he's from Greenup County too. So his involvement in thinking about this is quite important. So,
hello everyone. Our speaker today is Dr. Amy Clark, Associate Professor of Writing, Rhetoric, and Appalachian Studies at the University of Virginia's College at Wise. And she's also the founding director of the Appalachian Writing Project, a wonderful nonprofit that coaches teachers on ways to teach students how to write in standard American English without sacrificing the rich cultural heritage found in their dialect. She's also the co-editor of Talking Appalachian, Voice, Identity, and Community, which is a collection of writings that cover a range of topics such as the history and diversity of Appalachian dialects, overcoming stereotypes associated with Appalachian dialects, and contrastive analysis, which is an innovative method of teaching that allows Appalachian students to write original pieces both in standard American English and in their own dialect, so that they can understand the difference between the two, and so that they can understand when it is appropriate to do each. So, as a sociologist, I was just fascinated when I was reading this book about how it talks about the social construction of language, and how the fact that language is socially constructed serves to validate Appalachian dialects. As someone who is a native of Appalachia but rejected Appalachian culture earlier in life, this book helped contribute to my appreciation for Appalachian culture. And also, as someone who plans to teach college, I was really excited to read about contrastive analysis, because in the book it says that it engages Appalachian students who normally don't have an interest in writing. So to me, this is just an enlightening and inspiring book, and I'm sure that Amy's talk today will be as well.
I am so tickled to be here today. This is my first visit to Berea, and I love it already. I don't want to leave. But I've just been treated so well, and I've met so many fine people already. I just want to thank Chris Green for making this possible, and Silas, and everybody who coordinated this effort. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming today. And my husband's going to give me a 5-minute warning, so I may be just sort of weaving a little bit. I haven't timed this. It's been one more week, but I'll see if I can I'm speaking for a whole lot of people in this book. You know, this is not my book. This belongs to a whole lot of people who did a great deal of work to bring it about. But I thought I would open by giving you some background about why, speaking for myself, because Nancy couldn't be here with me, but why I came to this project and how I got the idea to do something that took about 6 years to complete. I grew up in the far southwestern corner of Virginia in what might be called the heart of Appalachia, a part of the state that converges with eastern Tennessee, eastern Kentucky, western North Carolina, and southern West Virginia. Born to teenage parents, I was a fourth living generation in a family of front porch storytellers, so numerous linguistic heirlooms were passed on to me over the years. My great-grandmother sparked my interest in the history of Appalachian Englishes. I grew up just a mile from her farm in Jonesville, Virginia. She referred to a bedspread as a counterpin, and the peacocks that clattered on the roof of her house and in the surrounding woods as peafowls. She talked about what she commenced to do that day and warned us that we would feel right common the next morning if we ate too many green apples. She and my great-grandfather told stories about the haints that had at certain points in their past revealed themselves up and down the holler where they lived and where we lived. While growing up, I attributed the different kind of English they spoke to their ages. I thought it was just the way older people from the hills talked. But I also remember how Mamaw described our ancestors, a strange breed she called them, originally from Scotland. It would be years later when I returned to her recorded voice and heard the melody in her vocabulary and grammar and the way she pronounced her words that I would begin to link her version of English to the place we call home and my own language patterns. Growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, I watched enough television to see and hear the cultural demarcation between mainstream America and my region, particularly the way people in my family and my community spoke. I loved to read, but I was never introduced to Appalachian literature in my high school English classes, where I might have recognized my home voice and that of the characters. And our curriculum didn't include discussions that invited Appalachian culture or issues. So I didn't identify as an Appalachian, and I didn't understand that I spoke a regional dialect. I thought it was just bad grammar, bad English. Because I devoured so much literature, I knew the rules of standard American English, and I knew the skill of code switching from an early age. I could turn off my dialect when I wanted to, but it was always at the risk of teasing from friends and family who thought standard English was for people that thought they were too good to be associated with our neck of the woods. And then I took a class when I was in college, my first class on Appalachian literature, and it just blew me away. And my professor gave me the option of doing an oral history in lieu of a research paper. And I took the oral history. And I had my great-grandmother in my life until my early 30s. So I decided to sit down with her and record her stories. I spent hours transcribing stories that I had heard growing up, but for the first time I was actually listening to the poetry of her dialect, the rhythm in her accent, the expressions as colorful and musty as old-timey clothing in a trunk, the creative syntax of her sentences. I realized that my entire life had been an education in Appalachian studies. There were people who wanted to read about the kinds of stories I had listened to over and over again, that my vernacular dialect, my home voice, would be invited into that discussion. It was a watershed moment in owning my identity. And so that sort of started me on the path to what this book is all about. And with that, I'll go into a couple of the myths, I guess, that also drove me toward the research that I did and the contacts that I made. What ultimately happened was I moved to Western Pennsylvania to do some graduate work, and I met Nancy there. And we started talking about the need for a project. I had done a lot of research on Appalachian dialects, but it was just pieces of things that were scattered in all these different publications. And I said, we need to have it all in one place. And we need to have a place where they're discussed in all their diversity. Because when we think about Appalachian English, we think about it in the singular, but it's actually very plural because it's quite diverse. And so I couldn't find something that talked about the dialects from Western Pennsylvania where I felt completely at home and did not expect that. And I didn't know why for a long time, but I felt completely at home there. All the way down to about northern Georgia. There are a couple of things that people believe to be true, and that's just what I was talking about, that it's a homogeneous English. And I had a lot of learning to do with this book because we started with the title Appalachian English, and that was put to rest pretty quickly because some of the people that we contacted to be in the book said, you can't call it that because there's no such thing. It's got to be Appalachian Englishes. And that sort of took a turn into talking Appalachian. But one of the things that we try to do is, even if it's just a little bit, touch on some of the differences along the Appalachian region. So we've got research about every one of these, and there are more that don't have specific names. And then the other myth that is so pervasive and stubborn is that it's a form of broken English, that the dialects are just an attempt to try to speak standard English that has never really worked, and that there's something wrong with people, that they must not be as intelligent, or that they just can't manage to do standard English very well. And so some of our contributors speak to that. I love Lee Smith's and Jane Hicks' stance on it. It's a political decision. That's what she tells everybody. But she says it's one that came with a cost. It always comes with a cost. And then, of course, Anita Puckett talks about how people use it to empower themselves. So there are reasons behind why people speak the way that they do. And the problem is that knowledge just isn't out there. Enough people just don't know the reasons why. In addressing this second rimmer, and another one of the things that, there's the map that discusses some of the areas. This is the map that we drew to go along with the book that sort of gives you an idea of the range of discussion in the book. The great thing, what I love about this book, is that we've combined some of the research about the dialects, the history of the Englishes, what's declining, what's staying, the ways that people use it for power. We've combined that with interpretive pieces written by Appalachian authors who talk about what it means to be an Appalachian speaker, or who talk about characters that use it for specific purposes. So we have an excerpt from Ron Rash's One Foot in Eden. I know he was here recently. I love Ron Rash's writing. I just think it's brilliant. Kenny, did you want to do this? Or do you want to? Okay. I don't think he knew about that.
I can do it.
Okay, would you mind? Might be a nice variation from my voice. This is an excerpt from One Foot in Eden that sort of goes along with this idea of, come on up, of why some people use the dialects that they use in spite of the stigma. What's your name?
Matt.
Hi, Matt. Nice to meet you. Thank
Likewise.
you.
Thank you.
Would you just read that section, please?
Just the whole page?
Yeah.
Okay. Holland Winchester's missing, Bobby said. His mama's got it in her head he's been killed. Bobby sounded hopeful. You don't think we'd be that lucky, do you? I said. Probably not, Bobby said, the hope in his voice giving way to irritation. Holland's truck is at the farm. It ain't like he would walk to a honky-tonk from there. He's probably just laying off drunk somewheres, probably down at the river. I told her to call if he comes back. Let's give him a couple of hours to wander back home, I said. Then I'll go up there and have a look-see. Janice sat at the kitchen table, and she flinched when I said, look-see. Hillbilly talk, Janice called such words, but it was the way most folks still spoke in Oconee County. It put people more at ease when you talked like them, and when you were the high sheriff, you spent a lot of time trying to put people at ease.
Thank you so much. Yeah, let's get him. The contributors, Lee Smith and Silas and Ron Rash, Jane Hicks, Denise Giardina, when they were asked to join this project, they chose what they wanted to be, what they wanted to reflect their stance on language, and so this was what he chose, or they chose to write something. So going back to the idea of diversity, I think to really understand the dialects, you've got to go back to migration, and I wanted to just touch on some of the historical information that we have in the book. This is what excited me when I first got turned on to the idea of learning more about linguistic history, and this is what I tell teachers, when you have students in your classes that are resisting any kind of instruction in standard English, and you want to talk about language and code switching, you really have to start with what they speak and honor that. And, I had no idea that I had a linguistic history. I had no idea that my dialect was full of these wonderful artifacts. So this is the kind of stuff that I find so interesting. And then I realized my mama was right. I had to go read the PhDs to realize my mama knew what she was talking about. At the time I just, oh yeah, right. But they know what they're talking about. So I think what's really interesting is how much the influence has lasted over hundreds of years. This won't be new to most of you, that the Scots-Irish is probably the most influential. There were 200,000 in 1776 and 2 million by the 19th century. And they found that the Germans had already settled most of the land in western Pennsylvania, so they turned south and fanned out along the Appalachian core. But some vocabulary and pronunciation that they brought with them and grammar patterns are still in use, mostly among older generations. And we have some research, particularly in West Virginia, where we know, the A prefix. I don't know if I have the A prefix, like a runnin', a goin'. That's dying out. That's being reduced. Older generations are saying things like that. But there are some things that are still around. Warsh is still around, and that's a good, artful Scots-Irish pronunciation. In Virginia, I was talking with some people this morning that said Kentucky has the same issue. We have oceanside Virginia, and we have the mountainside of Virginia, and we have northern Virginia, and those might as well be 3 different planets, completely different. But the mountainside is very artful in the warsh and the holler and the yeller. And the ocean side and flatland side is R-less, because that's where the London aristocracy settled to set up their plantations. And you still have the R-lessness, Dala. But it's very artful in the mountains. Haps for quilts. And these are just some of the vocabulary that still hangs around. Grammar patterns. It sets a lot of people free to realize that there's a reason why they say the things that they do. And I think it really helps teachers relax just a little bit to understand that their students are not just being difficult, that, it's sort of in their DNA to be speaking this way because of the, how far it's been passed down. But these are all, and some of this can be attributed to Scots-Irish influence as well. But again, coming back to the reasons why people speak the way that they do. I have students who email me regularizing irregular verbs all the time, and they speak to me that way, and I know they're doing that because they feel at ease with me. They know that I'm not correcting, in those contexts, I'm not correcting their English. But the English language is arbitrary and complex for no reason, and there's no reason for irregular verbs to exist. They just do. And so we make it simple. We regularize them. If the wind blows and you want it to blow in the past tense, you just put on ed on the end and you call it a day, right? There's no reason to go through all that stuff that you have to go through. So that's some of the reason why. It just makes it simpler, leveling these verbs, regularizing these verbs. And of course, we just like to intensify when we're describing things. We're storytellers. It's the oral tradition. And we just want to make sure you understand, right, when we're talking in the negative. I have a student that uses this. There was a time in my life when I would have just wanted to grind my teeth, but I just love to hear him say things like this. There's a new bookstore in town. Is there a way I can turn my paper in late? I just love it because I know why he's doing that. Now, he is an example of a student who wants to erase his dialect because he wants to go into radio, and he feels like there's no way that he can keep it. And that's a conversation we've been having this whole year, about erase or try to learn how to code switch. Now, grammar is one of 3 parts of dialect. We talk about grammar, phonology, and we talk about vocabulary when we're defining dialect. So these are some of the ways that we pronounce things. Denise Giardina chose a part of her novel, Storming Heaven, a section called Carrie Bishop, where Carrie is dismayed to hear that Miles, her brother, who has gone away to Berea, has stopped saying hit for it. And Ben says to Miles, well, Chaucer said hit. And Miles says, that was medieval. This is the technological, this is the scientific age. So that's a wonderful passage in part 2. Some other, we talked about the R-full expressions, holler and winder and yella, and the A prefix. And these things are not exclusive to Appalachia, obviously. We share features with other dialects. But these are pronunciations that you still hear. And then we think about historical influences, industrialization, and how much that diversified the dialects, the population shift, and the fact that language is always changing. It's always changing. But I think that makes it even more interesting that even with all of this change that has happened throughout Appalachia, there are still features that persist. There's still that part of us that is retained in language. But as people came in contact with more people from the outside and they got into jobs where they had to work with the public, that awareness of the difference and that awareness of the stigma grew. And of course, the more that was being published, and certainly with television, the documentaries during the War on Poverty, there were authors that told me that I think Jane Hicks was one of them, that said, I didn't know I was a poor hillbilly until they told me I was on TV. I think that created some awareness too, and a more emphasis on standardized speech in school. Silas has a wonderful essay that makes you laugh and cry at the same time, and that's a pretty interesting, if you can write something that makes people laugh and cry at the same time. But I have shared excerpts of this in readings, and I have seen people brought to tears by it. It's that moving. But he talks about his parents moving north to find work and coming up against the stigma. But the section I'm going to ask him to read is his encounter with a teacher, and he's graciously agreed to do that. So it's 2 pages right here.
I'm 12, the teacher's pet. I often get to lead the class in the Pledge of Allegiance. I am the first called on when I put up my hand. I have been personally selected by Mrs. Black to write the class play about FDR. But today, Mrs. Black is absent, and we have a substitute. Sour, sullen, angry for no good reason, although in retrospect I think it may have been because of her green, all-polyester dress suit that looked like the fabric of my granny's couch. Mrs. Black is always happy and excited about learning. This substitute does not want to be here. Plus, she is from off. Off is anywhere but here, and we hear people talk about it all the time. Oh, that preacher don't know what he's talking about. He's from off. She moved off and completely changed. Thinks she's better than us now. The substitute stands at the blackboard and slaps a ruler against her hand. Her cat's eye glasses look like something a teacher would wear on the Andy Griffith Show. Well, does anyone know the answer? We are studying caves. The question she has asked is why people shouldn't touch cave walls when they are spelunking. We all know the answer because Mrs. Black gave a good presentation on it yesterday, making spelunking my new favorite word, which I've been trying to work into a sentence naturally ever since. But this woman is too hateful and no one wants to cooperate. Darrell Carr does a bird call, hooty hoo, and everybody laughs. The miserable woman's brows arch in together. Have you kids not learned anything about caves? I raise my hand as I can't stand the silence stretching out across our classroom, and because I don't want her to think we're stupid. Yes, she nods to me, more exasperated than glad that I'm willing to answer. You shouldn't touch cave walls because the oil from your finger could stop a stalactite from growing. The substitute looks like she might laugh, then she looks mad again. Your answer is correct, but if you want people to take you seriously, you must stop talking like a hillbilly. I have been taught that this word is only acceptable when another hillbilly is using it. This woman is not my people. It's oil, she enunciates, not oil, and it's finger, not fanger. That's the way I talk, I counter, sitting up straighter in my desk, defiant. You talk wrong, she mimics, and laughs to herself. The whole class is silent. No one is laughing with her, and the shame rushing over me isn't because she's embarrassed me in front of my classmates. To them, she's only embarrassed herself. But because I know that really, She's making fun of my people.
So, in my chapter, I talk about becoming a teacher. And I don't want to think I was that kind of teacher. But I know that there was a lot I didn't know when I started teaching. Once I began teaching, I forgot, or maybe denied, the experience of being a vernacular speaking student, even though I was teaching in Central Appalachia, where my students and I share similar dialects. Before I returned to graduate school, my degrees were in literature, so I was trained to teach literary analysis, but not specifically trained to teach writing. As a student, I believed, as I had been taught, that any written dialect other than Standard American English was wrong, and the only way I knew how to respond to it in my students' writing was to correct it, as my teachers had done. So I passionately marked their papers and returned them and waited for the revisions, unaware that I was wasting my time and theirs with this process. My students broke my heart when they told me they hated to write. The hours I spent correcting papers seemed to have no effect. I watched as they got their papers, looked at their grades, and dropped them in the trash on the way out the door. I thought about quitting. I was a good teacher, I think, enthusiastic. I was innovative. I was passionate about inviting all things Appalachian into the curriculum. But the part of me responsible for teaching writing did not know how to respond to sentences like, "My brother and me drives the same truck." Even though I knew, based on my personal experience, how important these dialectal patterns were in their homes and groups and communities, reflecting on those early years in my career, I know that my understanding of grammar was limited to what I had learned in the traditional classroom, where vernacular dialects belonged only to the characters in the literature we studied. In students' writing, such dialects are considered incorrect in no uncertain terms, and dialects from rural Appalachia are simply unwelcome in most classrooms. Once I began teaching at the college level, it occurred to me that I was privileging the authors we were reading, but not my students' writing. With every mark, I was silencing their authentic voices. Every time I told them their dialect features were wrong, I was sending the same message about their homes, their communities, their values, their mama, their papa, their mom, their dad. And I was widening that gap between home and school that existed before they ever came to college, that delicate bridge that had been eroded. So, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't teach standard English. I want to make that clear. But the way I was going about it, by calling their home voices wrong in favor of the power dialect, I think probably did some damage in those early years. So when we started with the Appalachian Writing Project, one of the things that we did was, I'm going to skip ahead. We decided to do a study in the part of Virginia where we serve students and teachers, far southwestern Virginia. And we looked at the impact of dialect in student writing, which is not as pervasive as you might think. There's not that, I mean, students learn at an early age how to code shift. My 3-year-old and 5-year-old know how to code shift. It's really interesting to watch. But we didn't find that many patterns, but the patterns that the teachers did find, they decided to try this method of contrastive analysis, which we did not invent. But it's a way of teaching code switching. It's a way of teaching students, instead of erasing their home dialects, teach them the grammars of their dialects alongside the grammars of standard English, and let them compare and see and talk about how you get from this grammar to this grammar when you need it and in what context you need it. So we found that, we were dealing with some similar issues with the researchers who created the contrastive analysis method in Tidewater, Virginia, that some of our schools were dealing with some of the same problems, distribution of resources and the conditions of our schools and teacher training, standardized testing. We're a very assessment-aware state. And so that was having an effect, and I see teachers all the time who are just experiencing so much stress and burnout because of this. But my teachers spent a year teaching their students at the middle, secondary, and college levels to see if it would have any effect, change their language of instruction. Don't call it correct and incorrect. Don't call it good or bad anymore. Let's call it home voice and school voice, formal and informal, your vernacular dialect and your academic dialect. They did that, but they also taught the linguistic histories to their students. For the first time, their students were learning about why they speak the way that they do. And knowledge is power. That's an eye-opening thing to understand why, this has lasted so long. And in that regard, you can get some geography lessons in there, you can get some history lessons in there, you can cover a lot of things. And the writing scores went up dramatically. At the end of the year, at the middle school level, they were up by something like 70%. At the college level, it didn't have as great an effect, because by the time students are in college, it's a little bit harder to change, particularly in a year. It's a little bit harder to change attitudes about language, but it can be done. But we know that at elementary age is really when you should start teaching it, when you're actually teaching sentence structure. So that brings me to Georgella Lyon. I love Georgella. And she has this beautiful essay called Voice Place. And that's a beautiful word. I wish I could have called the book Voice Place, but that's her word. It's one of the most beautiful words I've ever heard. And I think she just nails it with that term, voice place, because it really puts two things together that sum up, I think, what vernacular dialect is about. She says, I believe you must trust your first voice, the one tuned by the people and place that made you, before you can speak your deepest truths. You can't be a voice box for your own feelings and experiences, much less for those of your place, if you've accepted the teaching that your first speech was wrong. For if you abandon or ridicule your voice place, you forfeit a deep spiritual connection. As Bobby Ann Mason said in a Kentucky education television profile, quote, I was not able to write stories until I got over being ashamed of how my people talked, end quote. How our people talked is the embrace of language that welcomed us into the world. It's nurture, humor, memory, and vision. It's what we must get back to in order to know ourselves, the first voice that teaches us to speak. I think she says that very well. There was one other slide and I've lost my clicker. There it is. I often get asked this question, do I think it's going to die out, the dialects? And not in my lifetime, I don't believe. But I think there are certainly some influences that will have a leveling effect on the way that people are speaking. Silas was talking to my class the other day, and he was talking about the difference in how his daughters speak now compared to how he speaks. But I also know that, I got away from it and then came back to it a little bit, but I'll never get it completely back. I think I've lost so much of it, and I think that's the sad thing for a lot of us is, by the time you realize you want it back, it's too late. Educational practices, along with the media, I think probably will have a lot to do with changes that take place. Plus, again, the fact that language is always changing with people coming in and going out of regions. If you've never heard Anne Shelby's poem Spell Check, she talks about this struggle with technology, and trying to write in dialect with using a computer, and the computer wants to standardize her language. Do I have time to read a little bit of that? I've got 5 minutes. I don't. Okay. Well, you'll have to read it in the book. It won't let you faller a feller at the holler is one of the great lines from that poem. I'll wrap up with this. This is a piece that I have written for, it hasn't come out yet. It will be out sometime this summer, but this is just an excerpt. Those of us who are easily identified by our languages or dialects understand Lyon's word. We live in the voice place no matter how far from home we find ourselves. Region and ethnicity are imprinted on our dialects, the harmony of pronunciation, vocabulary, and syntax that we might share with as few as 20 or as many as several thousand other people we don't know. Warsh happens in western Pennsylvania, just like it happens here. And I think that's one of the reasons why I felt so at home there. My dialect is a living artifact that has survived 500 years of critics, persecution, and doomsday predictions. People often ask me why some of us in Appalachia continue to talk this way when we know it invites prejudice or misunderstanding, particularly in those high-stakes moments that depend on first impressions. For all the progress we've made as a society, sameness, the standardization or suburbanization of language seems to be valued above difference. Author Lee Smith writes about this problem in her essay Southern Exposure, where she tells the story of a friend who encouraged her to take speech lessons in order to make a better impression on her audiences. "I have no intention of giving up this accent," she said. "It's a political decision." We talk this way because, as Georgella Lyon writes, there's a spiritual connection to voice place, to home, and to family. And because I know that every word, if it were a thing that could be polished and set on velvet, would belong in a museum with a printed history mounted beside it, an heirloom we can pass down through the generations, hoping our children will not erase it from their histories. Thank you.
Do you have resources for teachers to teach what you're talking about, where they're talking about the different grammars?
I am working on that. We have in my chapter, it's very descriptive about some of the things that the teachers use, but that's one of the things that we're working on as a companion website for teachers. But in the meantime, Rebecca Wheeler and Rachel Swords have a book on teaching code switching in rural schools. They have one in urban schools and one for rural schools, and you can find a lot of that in their books, particularly in the appendix. They were the ones that did the study that we examined. Yes?
I have a question, but I have to admit, from your talk, you've really given me insight into something. When I was growing up in California, we were always told we didn't have an accent. And now I can understand that means that we didn't sound like all these other people who were inferior because they did have accents.
Mm-hmm.
But my question was this. You talked about Appalachian Englishes and you cited some different states and cities. I wondered, have you done any work on Kentucky? Is there anything distinctive about the way Kentucky is speaks?
I haven't done any work specifically on Kentucky, and I don't think there's anything. A lot of the authors in Part 2 are from Kentucky. I don't think there's anything absolutely. I think because Eastern Kentucky has so much in common with the other states that border it, that Central Appalachian area is sort of considered very similar in terms of features. So that when research is done, it's the Central Appalachian, and a lot of people identify that as the Eastern Kentucky or East Tennessee. And they probably share a lot of features with Smoky Mountain English, which is identified in one of the research studies here.
I think Anita Puckett's.
Oh, that's right. Anita Puckett has her Ash Creek study about power. Thank you. Forgot about that. It's been a while since I've read my book. I had to get away from it for a while. Yes.
Just as other languages can be learned, such as Spanish or German in school, do you think Appalachian English is picked up or should be taught as a way to like embrace heritage or other dialects within the U.S.?
Judging by the actors I see on television, I'm going to say no.
Could you repeat the question? I couldn't hear it. Maybe, or she could repeat it.
I think
maybe.
he was asking, can Appalachian Englishes be learned or should they be taught in schools? Which might be two different questions. I think you can probably be trained in a dialect if you wanted to be able to use it. I do think that the features of the dialect should be taught as part of a curriculum that's teaching standard English. Because again, if you don't, it creates that dichotomy of right and wrong, that this is, and there are people that even resist the term standard English now. I went to a conference where there was this collective gasp in the room when I used the term standard English. I was behind, apparently, because that's changed to the language of wider communication or something like that. Seriously, it's LWC. I'm not there yet, but because it indicates there's a substandard, people don't like the term standard anymore. But I do think that it should be taught. Now, whether someone can be taught to speak it, I think you can live in an area and pick it up, right? My husband can.
I'm a recent import to this part of the country, and I'm eager to go through the process of picking up the language as it happens. But I have a question that comes from an observation from a staff member at Berea College who told me that he could recognize which holler a person is from by their language. So there's a fine-grainedness to talking Appalachian that I had no idea about, even if there are broader useful categories.
Yeah, you almost have to talk about it in some general terms, but you also know that 10 miles apart, two communities can have different vowel shifts. There can be differences, and that makes it also kind of hard to study. Because sociolinguists, when they do this, they create these isogloss maps where they listen for a particular word and the way that people say it, and they'll chart, until they don't hear it anymore, and then they're able to draw a boundary. But because language is spoken by people and people are constantly, it's very hard sometimes to say anything specific about a particular, but you're right, that's absolutely true. I know that's true in Wise County. You can tell if someone is from Pound or Big Stone Gap or Coburn just by, the difference in the way they say a word. Anything else? Yes.
When I ask our students here in the context of a particular course if they think their accent will be held against them in some
Sure.
way, unanimously the answer is yes, whether it's Appalachian students or international students. And I'm wondering, in your conversations with your students, what do you tell them about that challenge, that sort of subconsciousness that they are dealing with?
Well, I think it's true that linguistic prejudice is going to be everywhere, and it's sad to say that a lot of linguistic prejudice is a way for people to judge people, without being overtly racist or classist. It's a way for people to put themselves above others. That's never going to go away. It's the human condition. I think it's a personal choice that somebody has to make about. I tell them that I hope they'll never erase that part of themselves. That's where code switching comes in, being able to shift from your vernacular to a more standard version. But then again, that comes at a cost because you're giving up something. If it's for clarity, that's one thing. If you want to impress people, that's another. But I think it's so individual, and it depends on where you are and who you're with and what you're doing. So it's a complicated decision that people have to make for themselves, and I'm not romantic about it. I know that it's stigmatized, and I know that to some people it's just the ugliest thing they've ever heard, and that will never change. But again, it comes back to, for myself, it was learning standard English and knowing how to shift into it. And I think accent is never going to be judged as harshly as non-standard grammar will be. Accent and vocabulary, they don't carry as heavy a social tax as grammar patterns, double negatives and triple negatives. So that's another thing to consider as well. I can't be a role model for my students and use, ain't got none. Now, when I'm at home with my family, that's another story. I heard things coming out of my mouth Sunday that I was like, I can't believe I just said that. But I was regularizing verbs all over the place. But that's another key thing to consider, is if there's one place to start, it might be to really understand standard grammar patterns and know those well when you need them. Yeah.
On that note, though, I have always tried to have really good grammar, mostly because people expect me not to.
Right.
Because of my accent, sometimes people hear me being grammatically incorrect when I haven't been.
Right.
And I've heard people in retrospect say, "Oh, he talks so awful. He doesn't use proper grammar." And I always use proper grammar. And so it's like, just because of my accent, people hear that.
Yeah.
That's what drives me crazy, is when people will they'll talk about Appalachians and say they have bad grammar. I don't think that's always the case. I mean, I think I have a very Appalachian way of speaking, but I don't have bad grammar. I know lots of people who don't. So to me, that's the most frustrating part of it.
And yet you've held on to it.
Yes.
You haven't allowed it to change you.
Right.
And that's a hard thing to
Yeah.
do. That's a hard thing to do. Yes.
It seems that in teaching contrastive analysis, we need to be really intentionally interdisciplinary and think about teaching against stereotypes and about issues of race and class at the same time. So students can see that in a frame of a wider power issues in our country. And I think middle school and high school students are able to grasp onto that pretty easily.
You think they are?
I think they are.
Yeah.
They're able to handle it.
Could you repeat the
They're
question,
good.
please?
It was really more of a statement that middle school and, did you say elementary or middle and high school students?
Middle and high school, but I think upper elementary too, as I say.
That to teach contrastive analysis means you also have to introduce issues of class and race, because those are sort of and with Appalachian Englishes in particular, it's the judgment is rooted in class in particular, even though the dialects are diverse. It's really thought of as a language of working class white people, and so that's the stereotype.
The TV shows that are on right now just reinforce that for people who are outside the region especially.
Yeah, and because Appalachia is not a recognized ethnicity, not in the mainstream sense, it's still not taboo to make fun of in public. I mean, it's still okay because it's a yes.
Amy, the research that you've done shows some pretty drastic improvements in the areas that you studied. How much is this reaching teachers out there, and how common is it that teachers are starting to change the approaches to teaching writing?
It's reaching a lot of teachers, but it's slow. It's a slow process because teachers want to teach a certain way, but they're up against a curriculum that is driven by assessment, and assessment is driven by statistics, and statistics are tied to funding. So they feel
standardized tests are tied to.
It's scary. It's scary for them to completely change their thinking about how they're teaching, and so it's really a leap of faith. But I tell them, that this is how you have to think about it, is that they're getting double the grammar instruction. They don't know that, but if they're learning the grammar patterns of and the vocabulary of their dialects alongside those of Standard English, I mean, that's additional work that they're doing, and that's why it helps so much. But they're also allowed to write about their grammars in their own words without having to use linguistic terms, which stresses a lot of people out, because if you don't use them a lot, you forget. So I coach and coach and coach, and the teachers that I have in the network, they're doing the best that they can, but it's slow. It's a slow process. And sometimes when I do these workshops, I have administrators and teachers in the workshops who just sit there and shake their heads like this. I just can't do this. It's such a shift.
Results.
Right.
I mean,
that's what I'm hoping.
Is based on results.
Everything is based on results, and I'm not big on quantitative research because that's not my comfort zone. But I knew that would have to be included for that to reach the people that I needed to reach.
Well, let the revolution begin here. Thank you so much for coming here.